Good morning everyone. Last class we spoke about the lyrical poets and their poetry that has something or a lot of intimacy and sense of self and reflection and feelings. But that reflection, let's say, it's only incipient, and then we come to a process of to a period of maturity within Greek literature. And if you remember what I said last class, we have the period of infancy where imagination prevails. Then we find the period of the teenage years where feelings prevail. And now we're coming to the period of maturity where reflection prevails. Eventually we'll come to that old age where we see the decline of Greek literature and maybe some kind of longing for the past. But let's focus now on this period of maturity of Greek literature. I spoke about tragedy as some ground, as a very suitable ground for reflection. Besides tragedy, I also mentioned philosophy, and in this period we have great philosophers who reflect, and on top of that there's also something else: history, and actually history etymologically means research. Historiein means to do some research, and we find this as a period of reflection. This is what we have, and I'm going to focus now on the word drama. Drama comes from the Greek verb which is drao, which means the words you'll find them on the board, okay? The words I've written. Drao, which means to perform, to do, or to act. And this is something momentous. This is something that significantly influences the history of literature and of Western culture in general. You can even think about cinema in our days. What is cinema but a filmed theater play? So it is here where we begin performing, where we find a performance, where we find some drama, where we find action. How did we get here? How did we get here? A quick remark before I start speaking about the history of theater. When you read Shakespeare or when you read Sophocles, remember that these plays were not meant to be read. They were meant to be listened to. And eventually, after the invention of Greek theater, theater has evolved in various ways, and there are some theatrical plays or films that are mostly visual, and what impacts us, what catches our attention are the actions and not so much the speech. Instead, we find some other films where most of our attention is caught by the dialogue. Shakespearean theater is mostly dialogue. Because if you think about the structure of the globe, maybe in some seats they couldn't even see the actors, but they could listen to them. And to a significant extent, this is also what we find in Greek theater. In Greek theater, there was some kind of performance, but most of all, it was the dialogue and the intervention with the chorus. So I think it can be very helpful for you to try to listen to a play. Of course, reading it takes less time, and you can go through more plays if you read them, but nonetheless, try to see a performance, and this will give you a better idea of what theater is. Another quick question before I completely delve into this theme. What is the etymology of theater? Theatron. Tron, the ending, means instrument. What is thea, theaomai? To contemplate, right? So the theater is an instrument for contemplation. Around the 5th century in Athens, we have a tyrant. His name is Pisistratus. And at this point, Athens not only enters into Greek culture, but Athens assumes a leading role. If you remember what we have seen so far, there was no mention of Athens. And the Attic dialect, which was spoken in the Attic Peninsula, was never a literary language. Most of what we have seen so far is either Homeric Greek or Ionic Greek or Aeolic Greek. Maybe you can think of some Doric Greek from Bacchylides and Pindar, but it is here, it is in this moment where we encounter for the first time the Attic dialect being used for theater. And of course, money was involved, and this was a device to get money. Athens was prosperous, and every year the great feasts of the god Dionysius were celebrated in Athens. To make these feasts more attractive, Pisistratus commissioned Thespis of Icaria to come up with an idea. Because before Thespis, we had a professional chorus performing some chants. And through those chants, there was some reflection about some of the Greek myths. The great invention and the great innovation of Thespis of Icaria came when he decided to stand out of the chorus and to confront the chorus. And the word hypocrites, of course, now if you think of hypocrisy, you think of lying and deceit, but in those times it simply meant to respond, and they were concealed under a mask. Some say that this mask also helped their voices resonate. So the etymology of a hypocrite is somebody who's concealed behind a mask. Thespis of Icaria was the first one who came up with this idea of stepping out of the chorus and interacting with the chorus. So Thespis would ask or throw questions at the chorus, and the chorus would reply, or vice versa. And this innovation was very successful. People really liked it, and they came from all over Greece to Athens to see these festivals and to see these performances. Of course, this is very, very far removed from the theater as we know it. But it's the first step. After this first step, the second major step was that of Aeschylus. And Aeschylus incorporated a second actor. So instead of having one actor interacting with the chorus, we have two actors interacting sometimes with the chorus and sometimes between themselves. So they dialogue. You see how this is getting a lot closer to the theater as we know it. And if you read the works of Aeschylus, you will realize that practically nowhere we find more than two actors at the same time. Of course, we can have several actors in a play, but at the same time, we only have two actors interacting and a chorus that is in some kind of dialogue with them. With Sophocles, you can say that the percentage that is dedicated to the chorus decreases, although he added the number of the singers to the chorus. but we have a third actor. So we have now three actors that are interacting with the chorus and also dialogue and maintaining some kind of conversation among themselves. You can see now how we are getting a lot closer to the theater as we know it. Eventually, the chorus would decrease and even disappear, and we would end up with just the actors on the scene. Actually, many words like chorus, orchestra, scene, drama are Greek words. Right. Habitually, we had a trilogy, meaning that we had 3 plays and a satiric drama. So that gives us a massive amount of theatrical production. Unfortunately, most of it has been lost to us. But going back in time, back then they had 3 interconnected dramas. And to our days, only 1 trilogy survives. What we have are mostly isolated tragedies that were part of a trilogy, but the remaining parts of the trilogy have been lost. The only trilogy that has survived to our days is that of Aeschylus, where he deals with the return of Agamemnon and Orestes, and then how Orestes has to kill his own mother, and then he's chased until he is forgiven. So those are the 3 acts, the 3 parts of this trilogy. Some have seen a trilogy in Oedipus King, Antigone, and Oedipus at Colonus, but that was not a trilogy. All these plays were performed in different times, in different years, and some of them very, very distant in time. Sophocles also came up with the idea of condensing material. So in Aeschylus, we had 3 trilogies that have the same theme or that are dealing with the same myth, and how this myth evolves through 3 different tragedies. Instead, with Sophocles, material can be condensed, and the theme doesn't necessarily have to be the same. So he could present 3 tragedies about different themes, and in that way he condenses the reflection on a myth in one tragedy, a second tragedy, and a third tragedy, each one standing on its own. This was one of the innovations of Sophocles. And I'm going to start speaking now about Sophocles. You can find some resources, of course, on the internet, on the Encyclopedia Britannica. And I found also a very interesting study. It's written in Spanish. The author is Carlos Varias Garcia. He makes very, very interesting reflection, and I'm going to borrow a lot from this study for this presentation. Sophocles was born a few years before the Battle of Marathon. So he was born sometime around 497 BC. And he lived a long life. He lived more than 90 years, so he dies around 405. What does the name Sophocles mean? Glorious for his wisdom. His father's name was Sophilus, and he was an armor manufacturer. And he was born in the outskirts of Athens, the town of Colonus, Hippicus Colonus. And to honor and to elevate his hometown, he would dedicate one of his last tragedies, which was Oedipus at Colonus. He was always very proud about his Athenian heritage and his Athenian culture, and we'll get there eventually because that's We find Aeschylus, and he's earlier than Sophocles. But as soon as Sophocles enters into the theatrical contests, Aeschylus fades in obscurity. He had really not much to do against the talent of Sophocles. And Aeschylus was very talented, and he was recognized and he was appreciated in his time. But after Sophocles defeated him in the year 468, Aeschylus departed and he went to Sicily, where he would eventually die. And eventually we would also find a great figure who is Euripides. Euripides was a contemporary of Sophocles. He was born a few years after Sophocles, and he comes into the theatrical contests a few years after Sophocles. But since Sophocles had such a long life, and he even outlived Euripides, you can say that they were always contemporaries, and Euripides was very often obscured by Sophocles. Sophocles participated at least in 30 contests, of which he won 18. 18 times he won the first place, 12 times he won the second place. He never got the third place. And one of the great paradoxes is that Aristotle claims that Oedipus the king is the greatest tragedy ever written. Some other scholars prefer Antigone, but according to Aristotle, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the king, is the greatest tragedy ever written. And that play was one of the plays with which Sophocles got the second place. Let's go a little back in history to the year 480. Please try to remember something that you've seen in history or Western civilization. What happened in the year 480? The Battle of Salamis. The Battle of Salamis. And to celebrate this victory, Sophocles led the chants. So he was still a boy, but he was talented, and he was the leader of the chorus to celebrate the victory of Salamis. Who fought in the Battle of Salamis? Among many other soldiers, of course, Aeschylus. Aeschylus was a soldier at the Battle of Salamis. Aeschylus' brother died in the Battle of Marathon. Aeschylus instead fought in the Battle of Salamis, and he returned as one of the victorious soldiers who had defeated the contrary army in the Battle of Salamis. And that very day, Euripides was born. So we find the three great playwrights converging in some way or another with the Battle of Salamis. Eventually, some scholars have argued that it is not like that, and that actually Euripides was not born that very day. So they have questioned this. But regardless of the historical accuracy of this account, I think that the Greeks intended to convey a message, and they want to express how playwright and Greek tragedy brings together the Greeks, and they gain that awareness of being a unified people. Even if politically they were not unified, culturally they were unified, at least until the Peloponnesian War. there's where they split, and then the Macedonian Empire, which, by the way, was also Greek, although Demosthenes says they were barbarians, and that is just to belittle them, but they were Greeks. They spoke Greek. Philip of Macedonia and Alexander the Great spoke Greek. So they took over everything. And eventually we would get the Romans taking over in Greece. But we find this age of splendor of the Greek people, and this is an age where Athens takes the leading role, and especially Athens under the rule of Pericles. Pericles was very good friends with Sophocles. They were friends for over 30 years, and Pericles entrusted very significant roles to Sophocles. For example, in the year 443, Sophocles was appointed as the treasurer, which was a significant charge, especially having all of the Greek money converging in some way or another, or at least passing through the Delian League. Sophocles was also appointed as a general for a campaign against Samos, and they were very good friends. And it also makes me ask myself, and it's a question that I haven't completely answered, but I offer this question for your own reflection. If Sophocles and Pericles were so good friends, why is it that in that very year when he was appointed as general, he wrote the play of Antigone, a play that deals with a tyrant, Creon? Was that just incidental, or was it a coincidence? Or was he trying to admonish Pericles of the danger of becoming a tyrant? Or was that a reflection for the Athenians to see how great Pericles was in contrast with Creon? I'm just raising questions because those are questions that I myself have not completely answered, but it does make me reflect. When you think about the life of Sophocles and his friendship with Pericles, what could his intentions be when he was writing Antigone? And although Pericles was a great friend of Sophocles, his greatest friend was Herodotus, who has been also named the father of history. According to some, the first one to start writing historical accounts, inquiring the causes for those accounts. The connection of Sophocles and some great figures of his time and the political roles that he covered bring up also a question that is the relationship between literature and culture, or the relationship between literature and politics. And once I was asked what's the relationship between literature and politics, and I said, well, it depends very much on which author we are speaking about. Because definitely we find authors like Dante, Victor Hugo, and Sophocles himself, who were major political activists and covered major political roles, and their literary production, what they have bequeathed to posterity, is what they accomplished in their free time, which is a reason for us to admire how they were so involved with politics, and as a side distraction, they dedicated some time to literature, and they excelled there. Of course, then you have other authors like Virgil, Shakespeare, Octavio Paz, who are aware of politics, but don't get so involved into them. So you find that in their production there's awareness about politics, although they themselves do not take an active role in politics. And you can also see that in several authors. Finally, you find also some other authors that couldn't care less about politics, and they dedicate themselves to their writing in almost as some form of worship, and they couldn't be more detached from the political world. Like, for example, John Keats, Jorge Luis Borges, Franz Kafka. So we find different instances and different examples and different patterns in this relationship between literature and politics. But let's continue now speaking about Sophocles. He gained great fame, and his love for Athens made him very popular, even if maybe he was not a perfect general when he was entrusted with some campaign, and he might have blundered or made mistakes. People were very indulgent with him because he was popular and they loved him. By the way, just a person fast forward on the story, when he died, people celebrated his funerals with great honors, and for several years the day of his death was a feast, and an anniversary was celebrated, and the anniversary of his passing was celebrated as a major festivity for Athens. But let's go back now in time where we were, and because he was so famous not only in Athens but all over Greece, several rulers from foreign cities invited him to come over, and he never accepted. So he never left Athens, except when he was commissioned with an embassy or a legacy where he had to leave Athens, but he loved his home, his fatherland. He loved his fatherland, unlike Aeschylus, who departed and left Athens and went to Sicily. He died in Sicily. Or Euripides, who also spent some time in Macedon. There's in antiquity, and of course in our modern times, let's go back to antiquity. In antiquity, we find several biographers of Sophocles, and what we know to a significant extent has been handed over by those biographers from antiquity. And there's a very interesting event. Of course, I don't know how certain that is, but I think it might be quite accurate. And this happens at the end of the life of Sophocles. And I think this is also a very, very interesting thing for us to reflect on. His son, Iophon, got tired of waiting. Because remember, Sophocles was 90 years old and he was still healthy, and he wanted to have his inheritance. So he got tired of waiting and sued his own father. And he accused him before the judges of being senile, and he claimed that he could no longer handle his property. He could no longer manage his everyday affairs. So he claimed that the inheritance and the property, Sophocles' property, belonged to him. Do you know what was the defense Sophocles presented? He presented Oedipus at Colonos before the judges, and presenting that play, which was never represented during Sophocles' lifetime. It was represented posthumously by the other son of Sophocles. Presenting that play before the judges, he said, "You can judge whether I'm senile, whether I still have wit." And from that tragedy, let me just read you a few lines, which I find autobiographical. This is a theory very much of my own, but I think it's well grounded. So we know that he had this strife, this contention with his son, And there's a point in the play where Oedipus curses his son Polynices. These are the words, and there are several curses, but let me focus on this. Nothing thou art come thyself to my sad plight. Nothing is here for tears. It must be borne by me till death, and I shall think of thee as my murderer. Thou didst thrust me out, and I, therefore, just heaven hath an eye on thee. Howbeit, not yet with aspect so austere, as thou shalt soon experience, if indeed these banded hosts are moving against Thebes. That city thou canst never storm, but first shalt fall thou and thy brother, blood imbrued. Such curse I lately launched against you twain. Such curse I now invoke to fight for me, that ye may learn to honor those who bear thee, not flout a sideless father who begat degenerate sons. These maidens did not so. So referring to his two daughters, they did not dishonor him, but his sons did dishonor Oedipus. Therefore, my curse is stronger than thy throne, thy suppliants, if by right of laws eternal, primeval justice sits enthroned with Zeus. Begone, abhorred, disowned, no son of mine, thou vilest of vile, and take with thee this curse I leave thee as my last bequest. Those are very strong words, I think. And if you want food for reflection, compare these words with the prodigal son and the message of the gospel. Well, after his death, the Athenians wrote this epitaph in honor of Sophocles. Blessed is Sophocles, who had a long life, was a man both happy and talented, and the writer of many good tragedies. He ended his life well, without suffering any misfortune. That was his epitaph. That is what the Athenians wrote to honor Sophocles. Quick parenthesis, in Aeschylus' epitaph, we find no mention of his literary production. His great honor was to have fought in the Battle of Salamis. So that was what Aeschylus wanted to be remembered for, because he had taken an active role in the Battle of Salamis. And there's no mention of his literary production, but in Sophocles, definitely we find this mention of his literary production. His works. Sophocles wrote over 120 plays. Only 7 of them have survived. So now we only have 7 tragedies. The other tragedies, there are only fragments, and I practically think it's practically impossible to reconstruct any of those tragedies. We can get an idea of what the argument was, but we cannot reconstruct those tragedies. And they are more than, as I said, they are like 120 tragedies. Just think, if he participated in the contests 30 times, and each time he had to write a trilogy plus a satiric drama, that makes a lot of plays. Then he also wrote paeans, which are hymns dedicated especially to a victory, odes, and elegies. It was very noble of Sophocles to write an elegy after the death of Euripides. and he died shortly after that. But as I said, Sophocles survived his rival Euripides, and he wrote an elegy in honor of this great playwright. We're going to have Dr. Mercier explaining Euripides 1 week from today. He also wrote a treatise on the chorus, which has been lost to us. And let's focus now on what we have. We have Ajax, Antigone, the women of Trachis or Deianira, it's the same work, Oedipus Rex, Electra, Philoctetes, and Oedipus at Colonus. Ajax was written around the year 447. The Tarquins was written about around the year 442. And scholars suggest that these are the juvenile works of Sophocles. Of course, they are very mature works, but the full manifestation of Sophocles is still to be revealed. These tragedies deal with, let's say, a static I. The main character is static and reflects about his destiny, and he's led by his daimon, which is a Greek word to denote some kind of spirit. So there's some kind of spirit leading the main character, and it's mostly about the drama that the main character is suffering within himself in a static way as he's trying to obey his daimon. Okay? So this is what we find in the early production of Sophocles. And of course, the Tarquins and Antigone are almost contemporary works, but in Antigone we find much more developed Sophocles. In Antigone we find Antigone was written in the year 442. Oedipus Rex was written in the year 440. And here we find the full maturity of Sophocles. In these works, we find a profound reflection on freedom and how the main character is free to follow his daimon, but the presence of the gods ends up always coming through and accomplishing the fate. So there's this tension between fate and freedom, and this polarity between those two extremes on which Sophocles reflects, and he, more than give answers to these problems, he focuses on posing the right questions. So these plays are plays for us to reflect about these among many other themes. For next class, we can dedicate our time to bringing up our comments about Antigone. Okay, and I would like to dedicate our coming unit to Antigone to see what you have to say about it. If you haven't read it, please read it by this coming Thursday. And I think it's very important for us when we approach Antigone to try to understand the Greek mindset, which might be a little different or maybe a lot different from ours. In our common narratives, we find a main character, with the good guy, who fights the bad guys and ends up achieving victory. And that's a common narrative. We find that even in Odysseus, we find that in Virgil's Aeneid. So we find a main character who goes through a bunch of conflicts to end up succeeding. Okay, and that is very important in our Western culture, that narrative. But we can be deceived, we can be misled if we do not understand Antigone from its proper mindset, because it could very easily be read like Antigone is the main character, therefore she's good, and Creon is the tyrant, so he must be the villain, and you see it simply as Antigone having some kind of conflict as the main character against Creon, the villain. That was not the way the Greeks viewed this plays. Especially in Antigone, we find a conflict of values. And when you read the lines of King Creon, you realize that if they were placed, say, in the lips of Charlemagne, you would find great quotes about justice and about the value of law and about the value of civil order. So those are the values that Creon represents. And these values contrast or create some kind of conflict, and sometimes this is a conflict which has no answer with some other set of values. So you can see this as the conflict between law and state on the one hand, and piety and family on the other. Interesting to see also the conflict between a feminine and a masculine mindset. Or the conflict between a personal, intimate spirituality against organized religion. Because although the quiz of Creon might seem inhuman to our modern mindset, they were completely in line with the traditions, the culture, and the religion, the religious statutes of those times. So Creon is presenting himself in complete compliance with the law and the religious ordinances of his time. Is there some other form of spirituality that Antigone represents? And that's an open question that I hope we will have enough time to discuss in our coming session. You can also see excesses in Antigone. So it's not like everything is black and white. Antigone, the character, also is driven to some excesses, to the point that when she is going to be freed from her grave, she has already committed suicide. And she is criticized by the chorus, and the chorus is meant to be like the moral conscience. And she's criticized precisely because of her excesses. Of course, you can also see some excesses in Creon. To the point where sometimes I have sustained that maybe the main character is Creon, and some might argue back, right? But in Antigone, we do not see much of a change. Instead, in Creon, we see that radical change. When you think of the work of Oedipus the king, we see how Oedipus appears like a mighty figure in the beginning, and then he's completely destroyed. Don't you see that same progression in Creon? In the character, in Antigone, you see that same progression. Instead, Antigone remains unmoved. That's what makes me think that Creon could be also seen like the protagonist. Of course, there are many arguments against that, beginning with the title itself of the work. But I invite you also to read it from that other perspective. In the end, Creon is ruined, and Antigone seems to triumph even through her death. So I think this is going to be very interesting for our coming session when we're going to speak about Antigone. Just let me give you a few notes on the other works of Electra, Philoctetes, and Oedipus Colonus, which were represented respectively on 418, 409, and as I said, Oedipus at Colonus was represented posthumously in the year 401. Here, the role of the gods becomes marginal, and we find another kind of dialectic. We find that contrast not between the individual and his destiny, or between the individual and his daimon, or freedom and fate, but the contrast we find here is between I and you. My own self and your opposing self. And this tension usually goes in crescendo, especially in the tragedy of Electra. Finally, a significant part of the legacy of Sophocles, as opposed to that of Aeschylus, is the role and the respect and the reverence he has for women. We find female main characters like Antigone or Electra, and especially in Electra, Electra covers around 44% of the dialogues, which is something like 660 verses. So most of the tragedy, almost half of the tragedy, is Electra speaking. It's just Electra herself. Okay. So that's also a significant part of Sophocles' legacy. So his reflection, those themes that he presents through his tragedies, and the role that he gives to women. Okay, brothers?